So I'm going to bring up the conference chair of Where 2.0 and also involved in a lot of other things, including O'Reilly Ventures, Brady Forrest. Brady, you here? Welcome.
Thanks, John.
Good to see you, man.
It's great to be back. Last year, we talked with a bunch of mapping data providers, and maps really changed the web back in 2005 when Google Maps and Virtual Earth were launched. We were able to really annotate the web, mark what places, where our pictures were taken, where our stories actually occurred, but we couldn't actually share our location. We couldn't call that information up when we were in a specific location. But in the past 6 to 8 months, that's become possible through the iPhone, MS Mobile, Android, BlackBerry, and all the apps in their various app stores. We're now able to get our location easily, share it with our friends, with third-party providers. But it's not that simple. That brings up a whole slew of questions. Who owns that data? What can be done with that data? Do I control the data, or does the provider control the data? So I've asked 4 different geo experts to come up on stage and discuss their view of this. Now, starting off, I'm asking a woman whose business depends on location in the developing markets. Please welcome up MicroEnergy Credit's CEO, April Allderdice.
Thank you, Brady. MicroEnergy Credits links microfinance clients with revenues from the carbon markets when they invest in clean energy technologies. For example, here you see a woman who has an improved cook stove. When she shifted from a traditional charcoal stove to this efficient stove, it created 1.5 tons per year of carbon offsets, and that's worth about $75 on the carbon markets. In 2007, companies in Europe spent $30 billion on carbon credits to reduce climate change. However, high transaction costs prevent people in developing countries typically from accessing these carbon revenues, and that is because of high transaction costs associated with monitoring and tracking of the carbon credits. MicroEnergy Credits solves this problem because we work with microfinance institutions, and we leverage the core of microfinance loan officers who are already meeting with their clients. Every time a microfinance loan officer visits their client, they check to see if the energy system, a solar panel or improved cook stove, is still being used. And additionally, they use a GPS device provided by us to provide a geocode, which ensures that there's no double counting of energy installations. This gives us the auditable, granular, transparent data records that are necessary to make these people at the bottom of the pyramid investment grade. And the result is that micro-entrepreneurs in developing countries, for the first time, are able to have access to modern electricity and modern cooking fuel. So for example, you see here, this is our counterpart in Uganda. It's a microfinance loan officer from Finca, Uganda. And here is her client. There's the house, and you can see at the top of the house, there's the solar panel that they were able to buy, leveraging these carbon revenues. And this impacts schools, clinics, and new businesses like mobile phone charging stations. In fact, there's over 2.5 billion people who don't have access to modern energy. And Web 2.0, by creating an ability to receive information from the remotest and poorest parts of the world, is enabling us to create a handshake between these populations and the mainstream financial markets, and in this case, the carbon markets. And this is part of our larger vision, which is that people who are on their journey out of poverty, you get on a clean energy path as an integral part of that journey. Thank you.
But April's business wouldn't be viable without location-aware platforms like Android. So I'd like to welcome up Google's Rich Miner to talk about that.
So I think everyone knows, or maybe you don't, but a few weeks ago, Google announced with T-Mobile a phone that we're shipping, actually T-Mobile shipping, the T-Mobile G1. And I just want to point out a couple things about this device. So in my hand, this phone which has the compute power of a desktop PC from maybe just about 3 or 4 years ago, has 3 different ways of reporting my location. It has a built-in GPS chip. It has, since it has a mobile radio that works on the T-Mobile network, it can work with Google's Cell ID technology, which we just made a little bit more accurate. And it also has Wi-Fi, and using either, again, Google technology, which we just announced, we've added the Wi-Fi capabilities to the Cell ID tracking, or with technology like Skyhook, you can start to track my location based on all of those technologies. This phone, of course, then also has my calendar, my schedule, my buddy list, people I communicate with, their addresses, the addresses of the places I go to and visit. It has an implementation of Google Maps, of course, for mobile. And so when you start to tie all of these things together, you start to realize that the capabilities, especially in a platform like Android, which is designed for developers to take all of those capabilities I mentioned and use them as components to build on top of, you start to realize that for somebody to build an app that's a, where are my friends, are they near me, let me text them, and let's find a place that we can connect together in a few hours. An app like that, which literally last semester teaching a class at MIT, several students in building on top of the Android platform, just using our emulator, within a couple of weeks, we're able to pull those components together and build very significant applications like that. And that's just sort of before the platform was even launched. So we're very excited about tying location into context, putting those in a platform that allows people to build on top of, and then seeing what people are going to deliver back as powerful applications. We see our goal as building the platform and some of those core apps, but also enabling many other people to build. And one of Google's goals, of course, if you've used Google Mobile Maps and you see, when you check your location, you see this little blue ring that says where you are with some degree of accuracy. Our goal, of course, is to really shrink that blue ring as well, to really be able to pinpoint your location to enable those apps to work and behave even more accurately. And that's what we'll talk about today.
Thank you, Rich. And it's not just magic that makes your location available. It takes data providers, people who've driven around, found different ways of determining your location in a specific area. And one of those providers that you're going to be hearing about a lot in the coming weeks or months and years that provides location for Android, for the iPhone, for the iFi SD card is Skyhook. And I'd like to welcome out their CEO, Ted Morgan.
Thank you, Brady. Skyhook is a location technology company. So what we've done over the last 5 years is sent out thousands of people throughout North America, Europe, and Asia to literally drive every single street and map all the wireless signals that they're detecting. We started out with Wi-Fi, and we've, since that time, have collected over 70 million access points around the world and mapped their exact locations. And what our software then does is on any device, whether it's a phone, a laptop, or a camera, scans for those signals, checks that against our database, and can map your location to within 20 meters. What we've done since then is started to combine that Wi-Fi technology with cell tower locations as well as GPS satellites. And what that does is provide you a complete system for calculating location that works indoors or out, in rural environments or in downtown Manhattan. And now the iPhone 3G is the first device that integrates all these systems together. For those of you who have iPhones, Skyhook is the Wi-Fi location on every single iPhone and iPod Touch that ships. And what that's created by adding this with all these radios and making it free to developers is it's completely opened up the world for location-based apps. Since the App Store is launched, there are now close to 500 apps on the iPhone that use location for a whole variety of things, not just social networking, but for local search, for finding restaurants, for getting together with buddies, for carpooling. Anything you can imagine has now been deployed on this device. In addition to that, we're also doing a lot of work on the web. Recently, Mozilla launched their Geolocation plugin, which is based on Skyhook's technology. And what this allows websites to do is request the location of any user, provided they're comfortable with that, to make it easier to find the nearest store, make it easier to target advertising, make it easier to find your friends. And we're part of this working group that's driving this into every single browser. With that,
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Ted. As we're able to share our location, companies, third parties are able to aggregate that information and learn more about the world, which we can then share back and it'll affect our behavior. One of the companies that's hoping to make a lot of money with that is Sense Networks. They share our aggregated location data with hedge funds. That helps hedge funds decide how to spend their money. Please welcome out Sense Networks CEO, Greg Skibiski.
Thanks, Brady. It sounds like my investors must be in the audience with that money comment. Yeah, I'm the CEO of Sense Networks. My co-founders are Sandy Pentland, the head of human dynamics research at MIT, and Tony Jabara, who's the head of the machine learning lab at Columbia University. What we do is we analyze large amounts of location data, so from cell towers, GPS, Wi-Fi, all these things, to index the real world. So similar to how a search engine looks at the connections between all the pages on the internet, we look at the connections between all the places by week hour in the real world. And so by looking at the network that exists between places, similar to that's connect between links on pages online, we can understand the dynamics of the network and classify what kind of people are in all these different places and what does it mean to be in a particular place at a particular time. And so once we analyze the data using the machine learning concepts, we can put that analysis back onto the real world, and we can say that people in the lower left part, if they're at any of these places at the same time, they're a similar type of person, right? And if you're at these different places on top, they're different types of people. So we really do a bottom-up, data-driven approach to understand the real world. And by doing this, it really protects privacy and anonymity, that you don't really have to store location data about people, but you can give them some benefit, some relevant context in the world when they're in a certain place. So anyway, that helps us do discovery of new things. It helps us do recommendation, helps us do personalization, even churn modeling for carriers. So our customers are everybody from the little application providers who actually use our system that runs in the cloud. They have all this location data they're sitting on, and they say, I want to know, who are my customers, right? So you can put the location data in the platform, and you get some segmentation out of it, to the service providers, like handset manufacturers who actually have software and services groups who want to do recommendation and personalization. So it learns something about you, and not everybody sees the same thing, which is also good for ad targeting. And then in the end, also the carriers who are sitting on a lot of location data as well. Great.
Thank you, Greg. So there's 500 apps in the iPhone store, and most of the apps that I have are location aware. Why did it take so long? I've had a phone since 1998.
well, I think it's a combination of a lot of things. The App Store itself is one of a kind. It's the first time that app developers could easily get their products to market, and people could, with one click, download them. But they were also the first to make location free for developers. On traditional platforms like Brew and some of the Nokia devices, you had to pay per click every time you requested a location. And it was also very hard to get the location, to develop on it, and the location wasn't very accurate. So there wasn't a lot of appeal for this. And you had to go through the carriers, which meant years of testing and them approving your app. By opening it up, it really unleashed a lot of innovation. It's free to developers. Apple paid us and give it to developers for free. And so really just at the beginning of a whole new world. There's probably another 500 or so coming out over the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's another example of the carriers missing an opportunity to be a value-added pipe. They don't want to be a dumb pipe. They could be a value-added pipe, but they miss those opportunities. When I was at Orange, my team built the location API. I had a team in Boston that built the location API for Orange. We then wanted to develop apps on top of the location API. Orange, I was a subsidiary. I was part of Orange. They sent us a contract that was about an inch thick that they wanted us to execute in order to use the location API we developed.
And were they using the location for anything?
No, they saw it as an enabler, but carriers don't understand, really, they don't understand developers and they don't understand how to enable developers. So they just missed the opportunity to figure out how to make that available in a way that developers could easily consume it and leverage it. And as a result of that, you're seeing, today's devices bypassing the carrier, either with a cell ID technology or a Wi-Fi based technology, or just by putting GPS in the handset, and therefore you don't have to rely on the carriers. And so it's sort of a lost opportunity, I think, for them to monetize the location information they had.
So there's also has to have been technological innovations that have made it easier. What are some of those?
Well, a lot has to do with the devices getting smarter, having more radios on them. In our case, adding Wi-Fi to these devices allows you to create better location. That's taken a while for device makers to be willing to take on that cost and put those new radios in place. And just frankly, the developer community to have a chance to use it is really the biggest part.
Now, what I don't get is why Apple isn't letting us do background processing. Does anyone have any insight into that? I want my phone to update my location constantly, to share with my friends what I'm doing. Until then, a lot of the apps just aren't really worthwhile.
I can't speak to Apple why they're not letting people do that. On Android, you can access the location APIs. You can have a process running in the background. That process, if it detects some event that it wants to notify you about, the little status bar at the top of the phone, that application can post a notification in the status bar to tell you your friends near you, your bus that you want to take is coming down the street, or anything else. And so it's certainly a powerful capability to have something in the background watching out on your behalf for some event that's trying to connect you up spatially with people, places, or objects. And it's a great capability, and it would be nice if you could do that on more platforms.
April, you're working in countries outside of the US. What do you find there?
Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that cell phones are very widespread, and in fact, we're reaching 3.2 billion GSM subscriptions, so it's nearly half of the population of the globe has a cell phone. And the other good news is that the carriers in these emerging markets are investing in 3G. They are making smartphones available in their markets, but there is still a challenge. It doesn't seem that there's very much adoption of these smartphones in the wider market in these emerging markets. And you can see, if you just look at the economics of some of these smartphones, they cost maybe $500. And when you have the majority of the users are typically buying $60 phones, and they have an average revenue per user of maybe $5 or $10 per month, there's not really an economic case for these carriers to subsidize a smartphone for these markets. So instead, what we're finding is that while there is widespread adoption, people are typically using the simpler capabilities of more basic phones, so doing a lot with SMS messaging, for example.
I think what's going to happen, we recently just saw TeleAtlas get acquired by TomTom and Navtech get acquired by Nokia. And one of the ways they're going to pay for those acquisitions is by grabbing user data. You've already seen that with TeleAtlas's recent October update. It had 55,000 updates from users based on their locations and updates that they made on the fly. So I think we'll see data sources being created like Greg's. And what are some of the other applications out there?
I think that there's been an inflection point in the location market. I mean, I've been sitting since 2002, waiting actually to see if it was the right time to jump into this market. And I think that some of the key things are what you guys talked about. I think it's battery life. On my normal BlackBerry, I can tell it to do a background ping, like a heavy GPS ping that takes a lot of battery. And of course, Skyhook barely uses any battery, which is great. But even using GPS on a regular BlackBerry, you can ping once every 15 minutes for 24 hours a day. And I mean, maybe it decreases your overall battery in your BlackBerry by 20% or something, right? Which just still makes it very usable. So I think that's been a big factor. Another thing that's been interesting in the market in terms of getting the data and applications is that you do see the carriers kind of opening up in a similar way to they did SMS aggregators, where they picked these third-party services, right, that would do cross-carrier SMS. And if you remember, when SMS was just inside your carrier, it didn't really have a lot of value. But soon they took these aggregators outside of the carrier environment, allowed them to do cross-carrier SMS, and that's when SMS took off like a hockey stick. So I think we're seeing the same thing with the carriers now. Companies like Locade, for example, where they can do cross-carrier pinging, and if you send a text message to a short code, it can send you back something based on your location, right? Because you opted in by sending a short code, or if you visit a WAP page on any phone, right? It can translate your WAP ID to your cell phone and do a ping cross network, get your location, and give you the movie times for the movie nearest you, right? So this is stuff that the carriers are okay with right now, and for the very first time, you don't need to have a 3G smartphone or something like this. Suddenly you have T-Mobile's not online with this yet, but they will be in a few months. Suddenly you have 80% of the phones in the U.S. is the addressable market for this kind of background pinging through the network. And I agree the carriers are still a little difficult to work with, but that was the thing that when I saw that, I realized that 80% addressable market for location apps through background pinging, no new hardware. There's still a cost to doing that, but that's the thing that I think is opening up the door to a lot of new applications, and even things that don't operate involving your mobile phone. So what if you go to a website? Okay, and you're somebody's mom, and you don't know how to use your WAP, right? But you go to a website and you say, here's my phone number, I want you to learn something about me, and there is no mobile phone application, right? It just, you opt in online, like, for dating or whatever you want to do, and it never shares the data, it just learns something about you from your cell phone in the background, and then, you get some service that doesn't even have a mobile client or a web page. So I think, new services like that are the things that are going to grow this.
So who's missing the boat right now? And Apple, although they arguably created the market, are still hamstringing the market by not letting your phone do that constant ping, that constant update. But Facebook, for example, has one of the huge collection of people, but doesn't let you find out where your friends are. Who else?
Well, I think Facebook's a great example. Right now, there's some 70-plus apps on the iPhone that are social networking. Most of that just communicating your location to your friends. Something that Facebook could do very easily, and they have a series of great mobile apps. They've just been focused on other things. Twitter is probably another great example. There's a lot of add-on Twitter applications that use location, but Twitter itself doesn't. And so that's interesting why they aren't jumping on this, when people clearly want to communicate location as a part of who they are, the context of where they are, and what they're up to at any given time.
I mean, it's still early days. I wouldn't be too critical, right? We can still count the time since Apple released its SDK in months. Android phones have been out in a matter of weeks, right? So it's still early days. I think, to me, the exciting thing is we're starting to educate developers that location is just part of the core enablers that they have to build on top of. And so, instead of what is the one killer app, I think the fact that we now have tens of thousands of developers starting to think about how they can innovate on top of location, you'll start to see it find its way into apps. The friend finder, of course, is the most intuitive, but, I need a cab, one button, and the cab pulls up without me having to tell any other information. There's an app like that we have in the market on Android. Shopping, applications, clearly very powerful when you can start tying search to your location, which we can now start to do with Google Search, and so you can search for products, restaurants, or other things, and again, not having to enter your location just saves a lot of steps. So, we shouldn't be too hard. I think it's a little bit early. Yeah.
I guess I just want it now. And I mean, another type of app that hasn't really come up are the carbon footprint apps that let you calculate what you're doing constantly and how that's affecting the environment. But with all these apps that are coming up, there's going to need to be privacy and controls. And one application that when it launched earlier this year, really broke a lot of ground was Fire Eagle, which it's basically a gateway that controls who has your location. So any app that you authorize can update your location, and then it shares it out to any app that wants your location. Provides a lot of granular controls But this isn't common. This isn't something that's baked into the developer framework. And these type of rules need to be created. What other apps are we missing?
Yeah, I have some comments on that. I think that it's not just privacy. I think it's about an issue even lower level than that, which is data ownership. And we've been actually working for a long time with a team of lawyers. It's been very difficult, but we've actually have something we're launching at the World Economic Forum, which we hope that people will adopt, which is a completely new model to data ownership. And if you have a new model for data ownership, then you have a new model for privacy, right? Because you own your own data. And basically the concept is that you as an end consumer, you own your own data. So when people are walking around with apps and they're feeding some data into our system, you actually legally own that data that's in our system, right? And so that's pretty cool because you can control it, you can delete it, you have legal ownership, and we've built our systems from scratch so that any app that comes from us that may be storing location data, it has a button in it that says delete my last 24 hours, delete all my data, and actually does go into the servers, and it really deletes the data out. And somebody asked me once, so they're like, well, wouldn't that be obstruction of justice if you like burning your files or shredding something? And I was like, yeah, it would be exactly that, right? But you keep the power in the end consumer's hand. The unintended benefit of this actually turns out that if we let people own their own data, then we don't have a problem with people coming to us asking to see the data or the government or something, because we don't own it, right? So we've tried to turn this model around on its head, and not just with privacy, but and it's all about give and get, what you get for what you give in the application, but also down just to the core data ownership of I made this data, I should have the choice of who uses it, who transfers it, and when I want to delete it.
And it's one of the reasons why FireEagle doesn't actually store your location. So that way they don't have to deal with that messiness. But you have MyLoki, Ted.
Yeah, I mean, MyLoki is a service similar to FireEagle. We've in fact worked with FireEagle since the beginning. And I think a lot of what we're trying to learn is how do you make sure the consumer, the user, has as much control over their location without overwhelming them with knobs and switches? It's a very hard thing from a usability standpoint to give someone a sense of where they're giving their location, how granular to be, when to use it, when not, when to turn it off. And we haven't figured that out yet because this is so new. And so the FireEagle guys are doing a great job of that. With MyLoki, we've built on a lot of the work we've done in the browser so that laptop users can share their location. We're seeing that as part of this W3C forum with how do you set location and permissions. Because your browser today has a lot of controls in it around how you use cookies and domains, and most people really don't use that stuff. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility, but you don't use it. And that's the key here. And the other side of it is we want to be so careful about not creating the impression that we're tracking people. I mean, that's what kills our whole business, is when people start to get concerned that either the carrier or the government or even individual companies like us are in some way tracking individual users. So I would say that as an industry, we tend to go overboard in trying to be very conservative about that. We have no idea who is where at any given time across our system. We can see at an aggregate level, we can see usage behavior, but we can never track an individual user, and that's gone through lawyers at AOL, AT&T, Apple, and everyone's cleansed this out. But there's a downside to that. We have companies like Verizon that literally spent 2 years writing their privacy policy. All of their phones are location enabled, but they delayed the launch of all these apps for 2 years while they figured out how to write the 10-page disclaimer. And that just, I think the only way we really learn is by getting it in the hands of users, let app developers try out different models of usability, and then I think consumers will tell us what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, you need to have a combination of policy and transparency. And transparency, I think, is one of the most important things because, as stated, people aren't going to tweak lots of knobs and controls to change things. And I just think they have to know, is this app tracking me? Does it know my location and what's it doing with that information? And that has to be very clear. And people will abuse it. I mean, so people have, there have been cases where people abuse how social networks work. And that doesn't mean that we don't move forward with those technologies. It just means that, again, there's a little bit of a cycle. We improve the policy, we improve the level of transparency, and also educate people as to what it means to have their location information understood and known and shared.
And I think something that people are going to have to realize is that they are already, by having a cell phone, their location can be found out. The government, it can be subpoenaed, that information can be grabbed, and you're already sharing your location. It just comes down to who else do you want to share it with? And then what's the cost-benefit ratio? So is letting my friends know where I am worth sharing my data with that social network, or my location with that social network? Or in your case, providing a heat map of the activity in the city. Is that something that's worth sharing my location with you for? But Greg, you've brought some data with you.
Yes.
That shows what we can see from aggregate location. So if we could cue up those slides.
Sure. I brought some little treats with me, and this is based on some pretty publicly available data. This is taxi cab data. And we analyze all kinds of data. That's anything with a latitude, longitude, timestamp, metadata. And so in looking at this from kind of a financial services standpoint, and here's San Francisco, we try to look at the taxi cabs to see, taxi cabs are a great measure of human discretionary behavior. I mean, people really are making decisions, and it's almost as good as, looking at people moving around with their cell phones, but, this is very anonymous. So what we're looking at here is about 3 years of data from San Francisco, and what it shows is what time people come into work in the morning in the financial district of San Francisco. So on the top graph, that's the raw data. Kind of up is later and earlier is lower. And in the bottom graph, that's actually two smoothed graphs of the exact same data. So it's the, showing the trend in two different smoothings. And what you can see over the last 3 years is that it's really interesting in this data that human beings in aggregate, making their own individual decisions, exhibit market behavior. And this is something that we don't pretend to understand yet. We're actually launching a not-for-profit to fund social scientists and anthropologists to study this stuff. But isn't it interesting that over the last 3 years, while the market was going up, there's this market behavior with differing volatilities, and it goes right down to when the Dow hit its peak, and then it goes a whole different pattern up until very recently when the Dow cracked its one-year low, and then it changed completely again. You have this huge volatility sort of towards the end. So we don't know what all this means. We think it's mostly a lagging indicator, but it's really interesting to see aggregate analysis of humans. So we can go, next slide. And this is another interesting one where you kind of put in income levels of people. So what we're looking at here is actually when people get up in the morning in a residential area in San Francisco before 9 a.m., we're looking at when they take a taxi, we're looking at the block level census data to see what's their income level, right? So you see the blue line is the proportion of people of high income, and the green line is the proportion of people 50 to 75K middle income. So we're trying to understand how middle income consumers feel compared to high income consumers, and the bottom is the ratio of the two. So when the bottom is high, that's when middle income consumers are spending a lot of discretionary money on taxis compared to high income consumers. And so you see naturally that New Year's and Thanksgiving is a time when middle income consumers feel great. Some things make sense, like it says a bull market confidence. You see the market was doing great back then. You see all these, people with very high income, being very bullish and spending a lot of discretionary money. But the thing you can't understand is why is it on the right? Right before this whole correction took place, why is it that middle income consumers were just spending so much money for 3 months, discretionary money? And this is economic stuff that's very hard to measure. Or if you do measure it, they're sending out consumer confidence postcards and they're asking you to check off things, and it's filled with bias error because it's self-reported, and probably you're sitting in front of the TV, and if someone loses on Wheel of Jeopardy, or Wheel of Fortune, you probably feel worse about the economy. So this is really, it's about removing the bias from the analysis, which is what Google does in PageRank is they don't look at the page, they look at the links to the page to remove the bias error. So, and then last one is let's look at nightlife, how that's affected. On the bottom, you see the nightlife, the number of people going out every night, and the periodicity is the 7-day cycles of the weekends. So you see New Year's spikes over there. And then the two things in the middle are just two smooth versions, so you can see it more clearly, the pattern of over the last couple of years, people going out later and later and later on this green line until very recently, people were going out late, and then there was this huge volatility, right before, Lehman had their thing, and then everybody freaked out, and a lot of people started going out, and then the whole thing crashed. But the point is that, this
Are you
is...
saying they were drunk?
I'm saying that right before the crash, a lot of people were going out late. A few people were going out very late, and then as soon as the announcement came out, a lot of people started going out very late. So anyway, the point is, I'm just showing you this because you can do retail analysis, a lot of stuff. But the point is, this is a whole untapped field of when you look at people moving around in aggregate, now put me in the context of that. And so with the very same data, how could you make something for a consumer? So we just built for fun an application that puts that data in real time in the palm of your hand, and we call it CitySense. And it's not released yet for the iPhone in a couple of weeks, but it's on the BlackBerry. If you go to citysense.com, it's just a free application, and it shows you where is everybody going right now. And so it's just based on this, all this taxi cab data being processed in real time. And if it's midnight on a Tuesday night and you want to know, where is everybody, you just turn it on, and it's 2 minutes delayed from real time. And you go to the ¡1 spot, and I'll tell you, there's going to be a lot of people hanging out there. And that's not the easiest thing to find in San Francisco.
Thanks,
so,
Greg. Are there any questions from the audience? If so, come up to the mic. And one thing I like about CitySense is it's really clear what the cost-benefit ratio is. You are providing a heat map of where I can find companionship for the evening in exchange for my location.
It's not that popular, but...
What are some of the other apps doing?
Other applications, I think that you're exactly right. What you have as kind of an epiphany for this, Brady, is that I think you have to give people the right cost benefit. So if you want to get people's trust to use their data, and it's all about taking people's data and figuring out who are the people like me. I want to know people like me in terms of nightlife, in terms of shopping, in terms of I'm in a city I've never been. So it's all about using the location data to figure out a social graph. And if you want people to share their data, you need to give them something back in return, which is personalization of nightlife, or anything that provides value and stickiness for them. And I think we're just getting to the point where we have enough cool analytics that we can provide really cool advanced features that people say, what, take my data, this is so cool. Because before, nobody ever felt like sharing their data because you couldn't do anything cool with it.
All right. If you could just identify yourself and then say your question.
Ian Kennedy with Nokia. I wanted to ask you what the study, it was all taxi cabs, so did you actually put the devices in a taxi cab, and how did it turn on when the flag went down? Or?
Nope, we buy the data from all over the country, from all the taxi cab companies. It comes from the taxi cab to the dispatch, and we get it in real time over the internet, and we get a metered on-off status too.
And then how did you know that a wealthy person is driving the taxi cab or riding in the taxi cab now?
Oh, we don't know that. For the thing about the wealthy people, we looked at people leaving residential areas before 9 o'clock in the morning.
So zip code.
And we do block level census data. Yeah.
And they're kind of alluded to it. Are you planning on putting in additional profile data, this person connected to their social network, for instance? Is that part of what you're thinking about?
Well, we're not a consumer app company. That's just kind of a proof of concept, just to show off what the data is like and open people's minds. We create the analytics platform. So if someone else wants to use us, like Nokia, for example, we work with, you can take the data, put it into the platform. Out comes stuff like recommendation and personalization. So this is a data source I can show publicly and we use for demonstration. But it would be on Nokia's data from the platform of Nokia Maps, or a carrier or somebody like that you'd work with.
Next question.
Christian Peterson, Progression Partners. So given this is a kind of Web 2.0 focus, how do we go from, you say that people own their own data, how do we go to the point where that data becomes accessible for mashups all over the web?
Just a good question. I mean, with Google, we already have in Google Gears, there's a location API. So it's certainly on Android with our Android browser.
Not the location, people's data, their location being one of them.
Sorry?
I think the location is we're almost there to some extent, but
This is actually...
Just this demo went through a lot more data than just the location. So just the whole idea of how do we go to the point where mashups happen without having to have, I guess, each company make, joint ventures and all that.
This is actually a really, I don't want to say complicated, tricky scenario. There's a company called Doppler that a while ago, or currently, if you go on the Doppler site and you're logged in, you can see where your friends are traveling, and you can see their current location and where they're going to be. And that's the access that I as a user have. And they made that access available via their API. If I logged in with my token, I could get that data out via the API. And what they were doing was they were sharing, because it was giving my token, I could share that data out. And so it was going to third-party applications. And they realized suddenly they were sharing out other people's data just on my word that I trusted this third party and had to lock it down. And we're going to see more and more of that. So I don't think we're going to see applications like that coming out anytime soon, just because there's so many different scenarios of who do you trust and who can be trusted. But I'd now like to thank my panelists. Thank you all very much.